On a September morning in 1919, a powerful roar is heard echoing across Bredor Lake on Cape Breton Island. To incredulous onlookers, there seems to be a monster on the lake that might have come from a Jules Verne novel. A 10,000-pound mirage, it's part boat, part airplane, and it's going faster than anything they've ever seen before. It's like science fiction, but it's all true. And smiling before the newsreel cameras is a 72-year-old grandfather who's grown long accustomed to astounding the world with his genius. The world's fastest hydrofoil is just another in a long list of his inventions. You probably know this man as the inventor of the telephone. But when you get to know his extraordinary life story, you'll see he's done so much more than that. After all, Alexander Graham Bell, well, he's the greatest Canadian of all time. If you're serious about finding the greatest Canadian, you don't go to the big cities. Instead, you come here, to this hauntingly beautiful part of Canada, Cape Breton Island. You take Highway 205 and you head out of the town of Baddeck. And then you'll find the fabled house called Benvrea. Visitors who are lucky enough to be invited to this place find the enchanting home of Alexander Graham Bell. He lived here for nearly 36 years, dreaming and developing ideas that are so much a part of our lives today. When you come inside this house, the place that Bell loved most in the world, you can, quite literally, see Bell's greatness. You see, Alexander Graham Bell wrote down nearly everything he invented or thought or imagined into 600 extraordinary notebooks. It's like reading an instruction book to the future. Everything from telephones to wireless, from airplanes and boats, education systems, compost toilets. More than 100 years ago, this guy invented the modern age. Just flip through his notebooks yourself to see his greatness. Look at these extraordinary sketches. Here's the very first drawing of the telephone that changed the way we all live and work. Rural isolation disappears. Cities grow ever larger, sprouting vertically because phones replace messenger boys. Everything's now easier and safer. Just ask Shelby Derringer's mother.
The little girl called 911 when her mom didn't wake up from a nap. Paramedics say Shelby wasn't only helpful on the phone.
And while the phone is now indispensable to every aspect of modern life, would you believe this is just a small part of Bell's story?
Please hang up and try again.
Just flip through more of those magical notebooks and see for yourself. From the telephone with wires, Bell goes on to invent wireless communication. That's right, wireless, back in 1880. Bell calls it the photophone because it uses light, not wires, to transmit voice. And does it work? You bet it does. Long before the laser beam, Bell's wireless invention achieves distances of up to 7 miles. So think about it. We owe Alexander Graham Bell the internet, we own wireless communication, we own cell phones, we own fax machines. In other words, forget Marshall McLuhan. We owe the global village to Alexander Graham Bell. How much more do you need? The guy invented the age of communication. That alone makes Alexander Graham Bell the greatest Canadian of all time. And, well, we could just end the competition right there. But the thing is, when you look into Bell's extraordinary notebooks, you realize, well, that he's done so much more. The guy's a lot bigger than just the telephone. The fact is, Alexander Graham Bell's influence is everywhere. How do you know? Just strap in. Look up. Every time you ride in a plane, let's say like this 747 that I'm standing on, and you take off and land safely, well, you can thank Alexander Graham Bell. Why is that? Because of these things, the flaps. They're also called ailerons, and whose name is on the patent for these things? Alexander Graham Bell. Without these, planes can't turn or land safely. That's why Alexander Graham Bell is in the Aeronautical Hall of Fame. In fact, the very first flight in Canada took place where else? On Bell's property in 1909. Aeronautical pioneer? Of course he was. But with Bell, there's so much more. Like all of the greatest minds in history, Bell's curiosity is insatiable, and his stream of inventions is revolutionary. Take the tetrahedral. Bell built this 72-foot tower at the turn of the century using the simple principle of the three-dimensional triangle. Toronto's Skydome Sports Stadium is just one magnificent testament to Bell's belief that simple structures can produce amazing results. So this is just another miracle of modern engineering that we owe to Alexander Graham Bell, the pioneer of the space frame design today used on Hydra towers and in race cars. And Bell did it all more than a century ago. And would you believe that all that is just Bell's technical genius? But the thing is, the guy's no geek. What makes him the greatest Canadian of all is not that he's the forerunner to Bill Gates, but that he's another Leonardo da Vinci, a humanitarian and a Renaissance man who only wanted to make the world a better place. And that, too, is in the notebooks. How does a young man who'd rather spend hours studying how birds fly rather than doing his schoolwork invent something as mind-boggling as the telephone? Well, here's a clue. His mother, and later on his wife, are both deaf, and young Alex is obsessed by how sound is made and how to help the deaf learn how to use it. I see myself, first and foremost, Bell writes in his diary, as a teacher of the deaf, and Bell devotes his entire life to unlocking those prisons of silence. He's so impassioned, and he so inspires his students that Helen Keller, the 19th century's most well-known blind and deaf woman, actually dedicates her best-selling autobiography to him. She writes, "To Alexander Graham Bell, who has taught the deaf to speak, I dedicate this story of my life." Well, it's hard to get higher praise than that. Bell is a chronic workaholic. He stays up all night creating new ideas, not to make money, but to make a better world. And he does it in so many different ways. He uses his telephone technology to build a device that can probe the inside of the human body without using surgery, and he saves lives. He anticipates today's MRI machines by almost 100 years. He buys up an obscure science journal from Thomas Edison and shapes it into the most recognizable magazine ever produced. And from the beginning, Bell, the president of the National Geographic Society, gives it its famous mandate, the world and all that's in it. No sentence better encapsulates Bell than that, the world and everything that's in it. So let's sum it up. Bell invents the modern world. He does it for his mother and his wife. His inventions are all still in use 100 years later, and he lives right here in Canada. By any account, that should make Bell the greatest Canadian of all time. But then, how did Bell do it all? Now that's where the story gets really interesting. He'll have astonishing successes, but they don't come easily. There are failures to overcome, and there's personal tragedy to bear. But how Bell manages to overcome them all, that's what makes him the greatest Canadian of all. It's hard to believe that a little more than a century ago, the idea of sending speech down a wire was so wild, so impossible, that the inventor himself was afraid to talk about it because he feared people would call him crazy. But how did Bell do it? And how did this primitive technology become all this, the wired world that we know today with billions of calls? Well, to find out that extraordinary story, we've got to follow these connections back in time. Back before digital replaced analog, back before direct dial replaced the central exchange, even before the telegraph, back to the Victorian age, to a time where speech, with the proper accent, mind you, is king.
Oh, you're real good. Thank you, Captain.
Remember George Bernard Shaw's famous Eliza Doolittle being tutored by Henry Higgins on how to speak properly.
So horribly dirty.
In the Victorian era, everyone's obsessed with elocution. And after all, without the right accent, you're nothing. Bell's Scottish family is at the forefront of the elocution craze. In fact, Henry Higgins is allegedly based on Bell's grandfather, Alex Sr. So it's into this wonderful world of sound that on March 3rd, 1847, Alexander Bell is born in Edinburgh, Scotland. But Bell's world is not just about sound. It's also about silence and Bell's determination to overcome it. Bell becomes a gifted pianist, and his deaf mother Eliza likes to press her forehead against the piano in order to feel the sound vibrations. And then Alex discovers that when reading to his mother with his lips close to her face, she can sense the vibrations from his deep baritone voice. These lovely rituals between a mother and a son inspire Bell to think about sound in a new way, and later they'll prove crucial to his inventions. Bell's father is fascinated by a different aspect of sound, speech. He's become famous for his invention of a phonetics alphabet that he uses in his elocution classes. Well, Alex catches his father's enthusiasm for teaching, and soon they're helping the deaf to speak by using those breakthrough techniques they developed by teaching the Eliza Doolittles everywhere to sound posh.
Rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain.
Again.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain.
By George, he's got it.
Great lives begin with great dreams. And while Bell Sr. tries to perfect speech, his young son decides to go way beyond. He wants to capture it. This is a 19th century speaking machine, and it once wowed audiences in theaters across Europe. It's really a primitive synthesizer that uses air pumps and strings and piano keys to mechanically copy the movements of the tongue, larynx, and mouth. Crowds are shocked to hear a machine pronouncing vowels and even basic words. Well, sort of. Still, Bell is captivated by the idea, and he enlists his older brother Melville to help him build one. But how to do it? So they came down to their local butcher shop, and with his older brother Melly as his assistant, but without the helmet and the gown, young Alexander Graham Bell procured one of these, the throat of a sheep. He also had some rubber lips that he'd made and a plaster skull, and putting it all together, they built a primitive speaking machine. Pumping air furiously through this throat, the machine cried out, "Mama, Mama," so realistically that the neighbors complained about the noise, asking them to keep the noisy baby quiet. Well, this was just the first example of Bell's genius with machines and his obsession with sound. But just as young Bell begins to seriously study the possibilities of reproducing sound, tragedy. His younger brother Edward dies of tuberculosis, and then in 1870, his older brother Melville dies from it as well. And then Alec himself falls dangerously ill. His experiments are put on hold. In a desperate bid to save his last son, Bell Sr. decides to leave the rotten air of industrial England and move to Canada. And so in 1870, the Bell family buys a farm on the Grand River, very near the village of Brantford, Ontario, where Alex's father, Melville, has been invited to teach. Coming to Canada, Bell avoids the tragic fate of his brothers and his health recovers. Years later, he'll say that Canada saved his life. He loves to paddle along the Grand River right here and hunt along the banks. He calls this his dreaming place, and it will inspire his greatest work. Since there isn't a big demand for teachers of the deaf in Canada, Bell finds short-term work down in Boston. Using techniques he developed with his father and his grandfather, Bell teaches his deaf students to speak and to lip read. His success rate is nothing short of astonishing. And soon, Alexander Graham Bell is one of the most famous teachers of the deaf in all of North America. You see, Bell wants the deaf community to become active participants in mainstream society, not closeted away in some parallel universe of silence. And 150 years later, well, Bell's dream is still alive. You see, the Bell Institute, which is part of his own legacy, has joined an alliance with IBM and the University of Cape Breton to pioneer voice recognition technology. Soon, machines that look very much like your Palm Pilot will be able to simultaneously translate speech into text. That way, those experiences that the hearing population takes for granted, let's say listening to a waiter deliver the specials at a restaurant, can be enjoyed by everyone. I mean, the guy thought about everything. But in the midst of his successful teaching career, Bell is suddenly distracted by the two most powerful forces a young man ever faces: sex and electronics. And what he does with this potent combination will change the world forever.
It's your sweetheart. Which one? Your fiancé. Oh.
Well, of course I love him. He's the richest man in America.
Look, you know I love you and you love me. Life's no fun when we're not together.
You always did have a beautiful body. Beautiful.
Hey there. What do you feel like tonight? I'm all hot. Want me to tell you what I'm wearing? Why don't you just sit back and...
Whoa, I wonder what Alexander Graham Bell would make of that. Of course, the phone is used in so many different ways these days. I guess that's just a sign of Bell's greatness, you know, when everybody wants a piece of the action. But the fact is, sex, or romance, does have a lot to do with the invention of the telephone. Believe it or not, this is one of the greatest love stories you'll ever hear. Let's face it, you can't be the greatest Canadian unless you have a great heart. And Bell has that too. You see, while teaching in Boston, Bell falls in love with one of his deaf pupils, Mabel Hubbard. I have discovered that my interest in my dear pupil has ripened into a far deeper feeling, he writes. I have learned to love her. But Bell's a perfect Victorian gentleman, and instead of telling Mabel that he loves her, he buries his energies in his other great love, sound. Bell builds a primitive sound device using a human ear, That's right, a human ear that he obtains from a cadaver. And while yelling into it, he learns a crucial lesson, that the ear has a way of translating speech from sound waves. Waves. That's what Bell's thinking about on a hot July day in 1874 as he sits on the banks of the Grand River, his dreaming place. If he could translate those sound waves into electric impulses, he knows that he can send them down a wire just like a telegraph. But then he realizes that if he can retranslate those electric impulses back into sound waves at the receiving end, why then he can do the impossible. He can send human speech over wires, electric speech. And right there in a flood of inspiration, all of Bell's ideas about waves and vibrations and human speech come together. And he comes up with the fundamental concept that will become the telephone. Now that is what I call making waves. I have scarce dared to breathe the idea to anybody for fear of being thought insane, Bell writes in November 23rd, 1874 to his father. Please keep this paper as a record of the conception of the idea. And then there's a development in his secret love for Mabel. He's invited to have tea with her parents at their elegant home in Cambridge, across the river from Boston. Mabel's father, Gardner Hubbard, is a wealthy patent attorney, and Bell knows he has to make a good impression. As they meet in the drawing room of the great house, Bell notices a piano, the perfect way to break the ice. So he dazzles everyone with his musical virtuosity, little Chopin to soothe the savage father. After his performance, the excited young Bell does something very strange. He leans down and sticks his head inside the piano like this, and then in his deep baritone voice, he sings into the strings. To everyone's amazement, the strings sing right back to him at the very same frequency. This is a concept called sympathetic vibration. And Bell goes on to explain how this concept is central to a new idea he has for a new piece of communication technology, the one he thought of at the Dreaming Place in Canada. Well, is Hubbard impressed by all this? The guy is blown away. You see, in yet another fluke of destiny, Gardner Hubbard happens to be fighting with the telegraph giant, Western Union. Hubbard wants the young communication business to be more competitive, but Western Union controls all the patents. Bell's ideas, he quickly realizes, can take that monopoly down. And so they make a deal. Hubbard will give Bell the money to build his new invention, and Bell can have Mabel's hand in marriage. With love in his heart and money in his pocket, Bell, the ultimate do-it-yourselfer, sets out to work. Together with a young assistant named Thomas Watson, Bell struggles night and day to turn sound vibrations into electrical waves. He builds the apparatus he dreamt of back in Brantford, Ontario, but he just can't seem to make it work. But then in March of 1876, it finally happens. Bell is tinkering with his liquid transmitter, using sulfuric acid instead of water. His assistant Watson is in a separate room down the hall, anxiously waiting for some signal from Bell. And then Bell shouts out that famous sentence, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." As his 1922 movie shows, Watson is appropriately astonished. He joyfully proclaims that he can hear Bell's voice distinctly. Well, the truth is, the world's first voice transmission is anything but distinct. It will take another decade of improvements for that to happen. Still, Bell has done the impossible. The human voice has been transmitted over a copper wire. Bell's patent number 174465 becomes one of the most valuable patents ever issued, and it was filed just 2 short hours before Western Union submitted a rival claim. Inventing the telephone's one thing. Proving to the public it works, that's something else entirely. So Bell decides to conduct history's very first successful long-distance calls right here in Canada. Trudges over to the local hardware store and he buys up all their stovepipe wire, this stuff. He knows he can take one call at one time down these wires. Interesting to compare. The fiber optic cables that we use today look very similar, but one of these lines is capable of taking 500 million calls at the same time. But hey, the long-distance revolution had to start somewhere.
And so on the evening of August 4th, 1876, history is made. Bell strings a quarter-mile of stovepipe wire along split-rail fences from the Brantford Mount Pleasant telegraph line to a telephone sitting on the front porch of his parents' home near Brantford. That evening, guests are amazed to hear singing performed 4 miles away in the Mount Pleasant telegraph office. The dawning of the information age begins right here in Canada.
Clickety-click-click, the dials are swinging, ding-a-ling-ling, the bells are ringing, cha-la-la-la, hearts are singing, life is on the telephone.
The phone, as we all know, catches on like wildfire as telephones begin to wire the world. And like a good son, Alex gives the patent rights for Canada to his father, and Canadians will go on to be the biggest users of long distance of any nation in the world. And what about the love story that started it all? Well, the romance blossoms into a love affair that lasts half a century. On July 11th, 1877, the couple are married, and they honeymoon where else but Niagara Falls. A great Canadian like Bell knows our traditions oh so well. So what's a young man to do now that he's rich and famous? Royalties are pouring in. Does Bell retire to his millions? Absolutely not. The young inventor sets up experimental foundations, he funds research for the deaf, and then he looks for his next great challenge.
You know, the interesting thing about great men is that they never gloat about their accomplishments. They just move on to their next mission. That's exactly what Alexander Graham Bell does. He's already conquered space and distance. He's the father of communication, after all. But now he wants to conquer something even greater, gravity itself. And to do that, and he does, he emulates the masters, birds.
It's the party life.
If Alexander Graham Bell were around today, he'd be a megastar. He's Bono, he's the Dalai Lama, he's bigger than any Canadian has ever been then or since. Presidents and emperors all want to shake his hand. He receives honorary degrees from the greatest universities. The best and the brightest and the most beautiful clamor to speak with him. And Bell wants none of it.
It's the party life.
Even as he travels the world, Bell pines for his comfortable home, Benvrea in Cape Breton, because it's here that he can continue to invent. The funny thing is, the most successful inventor in the world actually worries that he just might be a one-hit wonder. As early as 1878, even as his telephone is being acclaimed around the world, Bell writes to his wife, Mabel, "Make me work at anything. It doesn't matter what. Only make me so that I may accomplish something." Imagine. So, what does he do to alleviate his feelings of inadequacy? Well, the man who's kick-started the era of modern communication goes, and he flies a kite. And not just any kite, big kites.
You see, Bell knew that the tetrahedral, or the three-dimensional triangle, is the perfect shape to build lightweight, solid structures. And he thought to himself, why not apply this concept to flight? And that's exactly what Bell did. He began to build these lightweight kites, just like this. Now, the one that we've built, based on Bell's designs, has 16 of these tetrahedral cells, but Bell built a kite with 1,300 of them. 1,300. Imagine the size of that kite. It was powerful enough to lift a man off the ground 30 feet in the air. And that was the whole point. You see, Bell was looking for a way to put humans in flight safely. And did his kite experiments work? You bet. Watch this. Just look at the different shapes of flying contraptions he builds. They're massive, wonderful, almost alien creations. And all the while, Bell is using them to unlock the secrets of the sky. As we all know, the Wright brothers are the first into the air with their 1903 flight at Kitty Hawk. But their planes are unstable and can't fly for very long. Bell knows he can beat his American competitors at their own game, and he does it right here in Canada. He brings a group of young, brilliant, and daring men to his Cape Breton home, and he forms the Aerial Experiment Association. These young men wonder what drives Alexander Bell's passion to conquer new frontiers, and soon they find out. Not only is the great Alexander Bell driven by insatiable curiosity, he's driven by tragedy as well. Because while Alexander and Mabel have two wonderful daughters, Elsie May and Daisy, they also had two sons, both of whom died a few days after birth. Bell is devastated, so it's no surprise that he and Mabel treat those pioneer aviators as their surrogate sons. One engineer even calls Mabel the little mother of us all. Bell is inspired by the enthusiasm of these young men. Together, they make aviation history, though Bell always makes sure that they, and not he, get the credit for their inventions. But just as they're about to enjoy their first triumph, tragedy. Thomas Selfridge, one of Bell's aerodrome boys, volunteers to take a test flight with the famous Wright brothers. But the plane falters and crashes. Orville Wright is badly injured, but Thomas Selfridge is killed, and he becomes the world's first aviation casualty. Bell is stricken by the loss, and he's determined to make aircraft more stable. So he and his team designed the revolutionary aileron, the flaps you see today on planes. Even now, this device allows planes to turn gently and stay in control. It and other pioneering technologies let Bell and his team beat the Wright brothers and win North America's very first aviation prize. They build the first aircraft to fly a 1-kilometer circuit on July 4th, 1908. And they make history again just a year later, when one of Bell's aviation boys, John McCurdy, makes the very first flight ever in Canada. The great Silver Dart flies over Cape Breton Island, and it's just one more example of Alexander Graham Bell's genius. As Bell ages physically, his enthusiasm and his curiosity and his love of life never do. I mean, here's a guy who still loves to skinny dip in the lake and play piano at parties and then work all night inventing. While most people his age are thinking about golf, Bell is still creating. He helps design his now famous hydrofoil just 3 years before his death, and just look at its legacy. Bell would have loved what's happened to his hydrofoil technology today. Hydrofoils are now used all over the world, like this one that takes passengers from Montreal to Quebec City and back at speeds of up to 65 kilometers an hour.
the remarkable thing in all this is that Bell's work never seems to interfere with his family life. 6 generations of Bells still talk about his devotion and the time he spent with them, his love of children, his passion for play. And his descendants still live in his beautiful house, Benvrea. In fact, you could argue that Bell's family is his greatest accomplishment of all. He's a hero not only because of his inventions, but because of his generous and gracious heart. On August 2nd, 1922, as Bell lies dying in his Cape Breton home, his beloved wife Mabel at his side, she whispers, "Don't go." His fingers clasp hers with the old sign for no. In a sense, Alexander Graham Bell never leaves Mabel or any of us. His legacy continues to this day. His great rival, Thomas Edison, upon hearing of Bell's death, writes, "His world-famous invention annihilated time and space, and he brought the human family in closer touch." The world agreed. And so, at 6:25 p.m. on August 4th, 1922, telephones and switchboards across the USA and Canada stopped. For 1 minute, the modern world stayed silent in honor of the man who created it, a man who died right here in Canada. It's never happened before, and it's never happened since. Of course, other advocates are going to say that their candidate is the greatest Canadian, and in truth, they are great people, make no mistake about it, but let's boil it down to a simple test. Could the world get on without their contribution? Could you get on? Let's face it, we all know we could use a few less politicians and a few less high-priced hockey players, heck, a few less television hosts, but no Alexander Graham Bell? Could you live without the telephone, the internet, boats, planes, education systems? Without Alexander Graham Bell, the modern world would grind to a halt. Try even voting for another candidate without using Bell's invention. You can't do it because Bell is everywhere. Well, someone might say he doesn't belong exclusively to Canada. The Americans claim him and the Scottish claim him, and that's true. But that's just another sign of his greatness. Everybody wants a piece of the action. But rest assured, folks, Alexander Graham Bell belongs to us. And how do you know? Well, just come here to the beautiful mountain where Bell and his wife chose to be buried, overlooking this vast and lonely land that Bell's invention turned into an intimate community. And here, as everywhere across Canada, you feel that deep connection to Alexander Graham Bell. And you know, and I know, that Alexander Graham Bell, well, he's the greatest Canadian of all time.